Hello, everybody. My name is Ian, and today we're talking about Lucy Long's Culinary Tourism, a folkloristic perspective on eating and otherness. Um, the whole concept, tourism is a very large subject to try and get our heads around, but we want to be thinking about tourism not simply as some kind of industry. When people have come across this, they might be thinking immediately in terms of sort of a business oriented or a hospitality and tourism management oriented aspect of the study of food. And that is sort of bubbling under the surface. But we want to be thinking about tourism less as, or at least not first and foremost, as the infrastructure of tourism, and more as a way of being in the world. So tourism is, if we want to think of it less as that sort of business, or at least not yet talking about it as sort of a business, we want to be thinking of tourism as a way of apprehending. That tourism is the leisured experience of otherness. There's a whole bunch of different definitions that we could pick and choose. There's Dean McCannell's, there's John Urry's, and if not necessarily definitions, then at least influences that can be had. So yeah, a quality of experiencing is one of the ways that we can think about it. And that to be a tourist, or at least to think touristically, to be momentarily taking on the mantle of tourist, is to be interested temporarily in otherness, something that is different from the day to day. So tourism, at least in terms of most tourist theorists, and the way that Lucy Long is talking about it, is about what happens when we just, for no other practical reason, save for the fact that we imagine that it is going to give us some kind of pleasure or some kind of interesting experience or some kind of moment of difference, we investigate, we try and experience the food systems of somewhere else. So it can be, of course, traveling to a place, the sort of the standard idea of tourism, but it could also be reading about food, reading the sort of going through blogs and recipes and coming across not simply the food, the ingredients list and the preparation instructions, but the narrative that people attach to their recipes. It can be about leafing through cooking magazines. It can be about websites and so on. It can be about going to local restaurants that frame themselves as, for lack of a better word, ethnic or regional, or who are already presenting a food that is ostensibly different from the food that you would be able to get at home, or the food that is typically available in this community. Or conversely, of course, there are local food places that are much more oriented towards the actual tourists, the people coming from away to this place, like come and experience authentic Atlantic Canadian food in an authentic Atlantic Canadian experience. And so the food is, in theory, something that the local would be used to. Now, there's an interesting distinction there, because tourism is about, the business of tourism is about trying to apprehend the other's expectations of otherness. And we can think about William Hugh Jansen's idea of esoteric and exoteric when it comes to tourism. And that what Jansen talks about is esoteric is basically the things that we think about ourselves, and exoteric are the things that we think about the other. And then he reflects on that. He sort of doubles down, and that we have another form of esoteric lore is the things we think the other thinks about us. And then there's that additional idea of the things we think the other thinks we think about them. But it's that reflective esotericism that's really important for tourism. The things we think the other thinks about us are the things that we think when we're thinking touristically, or when we're thinking about presenting ourselves touristically. It is the things that we anticipate someone who is coming from elsewhere would be interested in casting their tourist gaze upon. And so our normal food, the food that we might regularly eat, is not necessarily the what is of interest. It is the stuff that we think they will think is unique and distinct and authentic to this place. And there's sort of two thoughts that are bubbling through there. I'm trying to think which one to talk about first. And I guess the first one to talk about is this idea of the tourist gaze. That's John Urie's idea. And the idea is that when you are, he's using tourist gaze in the same way that we might talk about the male gaze, in that it is what the eye seeks out. And the tourist gaze, when someone is engaged in the tourist gaze, they are seeking out otherness. Their eyes are drawn to otherness. And tourism as a business reflects upon that and creates these things upon which one can cast the tourist gaze. So issues of landscape, unique experiences that you imagine are not going to be somewhere else. And I mean, those are the expectations that are met. When one is a tourist, one is often drawn to things that are other. And if you've ever gone on school trips somewhere, it's really great to go to the grocery store with a gang of people who have never really left their hometown before. And they're like, oh, look, in England, they don't refrigerate their eggs. What's with that? And it's those kind of levels of difference that people are kind of fascinated by. The second theme that was sort of bubbling around the issue, around the term, is this issue of authenticity. Authenticity is such a loaded word, and we are constantly imagining. I mean, if you've been paying attention to the study of folklore, you know what a loaded word this is, because the idea that there is some true form out there is going to inform so much of folklore study. The idea that there is some kind of thing. Not that folklorists imagine that, at least not in the 21st century, but still the presentation that there's somewhere there is the perfect version of it, and everything else is kind of a poor simulacra of it, and it is only a mere imitation, and often it is a reduction or diminution or degradation of that. And the notion, Dean McCannell's idea of tourism, is that one of the things that one is looking for is one is craving the authentic other, the real experience. The idea, oh, this is something that has, that I could not experience elsewhere. And basically, where that level of authenticity connects tourism into almost the idea of pilgrimage. And that the experiencing of an authentic other is transformative in some way. And so the very act of being a tourist, and particularly when we're talking about tourism that involves travel, as opposed to simply sort of sitting in one's, on one's iPad, flipping through food blogs, that experience of otherness is meant to sort of be a moment of encounter, a moment of transformation, and almost has that expectation of ritual, in that it's transformative, a rite of passage. There's a liminality that takes place when one has one's authentic or experience with authenticity. And again, air quotes all around. That being said, on the personal level, we probably do have these moments, at least at the very least, whether or not those things are authentic, and that is a question that we can just raise and then put to the side. We can nevertheless talk about these moments where we went somewhere and had a transformative experience, because it is about the apprehension of otherness. It is about the understanding, the personal interpretation of these things as moments of encounter with other, that shift. Now, when I talked about this issue of sort of, associating with pilgrimage, there's a lot of literature out there that equates tourism with both pilgrimage, almost literally the idea that the pilgrim was sort of one of the first kinds of tourists, because they went to these sacred places, because they went to this landscape that was narratively framed as important. And so it was part of an obligation to go there, but the travel to and the travel from was just as much a part of it. So that is a whole part of the sequence of travel, plus the idea of the association of like relics and holy and things at holy sites as co-equivalent with the souvenir. But not only is the tourist and the pilgrim associated with each other, but also, ironically, the anthropologist and the folklorist and the ethnographer going to a place to have some kind of transformative experience. So the idea of the anthropologist as tourist, as pilgrim, is something that kind of bubbles around the surface. So we've talked about the idea of the tourist gaze, we've talked about the idea of authenticity, and now one of the things to talk about as we consider folklore as the study of audiences is that now we're sort of bringing back that apparatus, the business apparatus that we were momentarily not talking about. And the idea is that there are a group of people who wish to experience otherness to various levels of degree of authenticity. And there's an apparatus that wishes to accommodate, wishes to capitalize on, clearly, wishes to profit from, but also wishes to meet the needs of otherness. And there's an economic stimulus that's available. Much of the history of Atlantic Canada in the 20th century is predicated on the idea that this is a place that can draw the tourist gaze. How do we communicate that to the outside world? How do we accommodate the people who are here? How do we meet their expectations of otherness while also meeting their expectations of things like having a place to stay and having a road that is paved and all the things that a contemporary tourist would appreciate, especially if we're sort of hovering around the issues of how intense a level of authentic experience people wish to have. Where do we attract people to? Where do we push people away from? Because when one looks at our contemporary landscape, this isn't a matter necessarily of things being unattractive and attractive, but it might be a matter of it's unappealing to the tourist gaze and appealing to the tourist gaze. So Atlantic Canada has as many suburbs and subdivisions and tract homes as elsewhere, and that isn't where the tourists go. Tourists like to go to waterfronts. Tourists like to go to old industrial sites. Tourists like to go to see landscape, because those are the things here that are different from where they come from. And that's one of the things that, and so even though our lives are meaningfully spent both in those special landscapes and in those not particularly special landscapes, but landscapes that we have made special by living in them, by narrativizing them, the narrative of a suburb is too difficult to communicate, so they fall outside the track. In the same way that food will operate in a similar way, in that the special foods we might partake in, but we'll also partake in the standard North American foods. But those standard North American foods don't communicate well into the tourist argument, because someone coming from away doesn't necessarily understand how pizza or fried chicken or whatever works, just as random examples, works within the local food system, because it's like, I can get pizza at home. So it falls outside of that, and we go back to the things that those reflective esoteric, the food that we think that other people think is unique to this place. So tourism is about the meeting of an audience and a performer. If we want to think of tourism operators as performers, they are what distinguishes a good tourist operator from a bad tourist operator, what is the same thing that distinguishes a good folk performer from a bad folk performer, and it has to do with how well they understand their prospective audiences. Sorry, I just need to pause because I realize I'm revolutionizing the discipline once again. So anyway, so tourism operates in this way, and Lucy Long suggests a number of different ways of doing it. So it can be, and we can go back to some of our basic understandings of food, in that because food is also immersive, because food is first it does have that association with hospitality and breaking bread and sharing food, even within the artificial context of tourism. There is something that much more immediate about a place, and it is sensory, it is immersive. So it's not only a different quality of sharing in terms of the people that you are sharing it with, it's a different kind of experiencing because it involves, because it is immersive in all five senses. It does involve, as opposed to the tourist gaze, which really is focused on the visual. There is the visual, the text, the taste, touch, smell, sound, and then if we want to sort of think of it in a Proustian sense, memory. All of those senses are engaged when it comes to culinary tourism. So, and why we engage in it, again, we don't want to think of ourselves necessarily as a homogeneous whole, but experiencing otherness, experiencing difference is, I think, a reasonably standard activity that we partake in as a form of leisure. We are not obligated to, but sometimes we are experiencing otherness. And so when we think about, one of the things we want to think about when we consider culinary tourism and consider food systems is that when we are engaging with food systems not our own, we are already assuming our own food systems, which is of course entirely subjective, but nevertheless we can think about them. We can think about sort of one's home food systems as a kind of baseline for subjective experiencing of otherness, because those are the criteria. What we have already understood, what we have already consumed, what we have already tasted, are going to be the data points, as it were, by which otherness is ultimately going to be experienced once, or assessed once we actually eat other food. But it's also going to be the systems by which we assess what we consider eating. So it's also prospective. It isn't simply after the fact. It's like, this tastes like this thing that I'm used to. It's the, I imagine this kind of tastes like this, because we are talking about expectations. Again, we can reflect on it, but we are also we can reflect on, I got it. We can reflect on it after the performance, but we also think about what's going to happen when we get to the performance. And what we think is going to happen when we get to the performance is in part going to be the same kind of questions that the performer is going to give. Now just replace the word performer with performance with meal, and performer with meal preparer, and we've got something going there. She also sets out this wonderful, these incredibly useful ways of thinking about food and otherness, and she talks about these dimensions of otherness. That in terms of sort of like the systems that we might be experiencing as different. She lists 7. She dismisses 2. And I think she dismisses 2 because tourism operators don't necessarily work in those 2. But nevertheless, I think we can think of, when we think about the person themselves wishing to experience otherness, they are quite alive. They just don't necessarily have a tourism infrastructure around them. And so she talks about differences in terms of culture. So we can think the ethnic restaurant, sort of the classic example. Something that is of a different sociocultural systems, foodways that are dependent a lot on ideas of heritage, ideas of ancestry, ideas of ethnicity, and so on. So, a group perhaps whose food systems are based in a particular region, but also a region with a particular history that has manifested and lifted itself into a set of expectations that are there. Italian food, French food, German food, for example. Systems that we can cut off as different from, again, our subjective baseline of regular. Now, that's not to say that there are not complexities there. And of course, all of those have regions associated with them. And what the locals have in those various places might differ radically from what is being presented to us as representative of those, especially when we are talking not simply about the food that one gets in Germany, but a German restaurant has opened up in Toronto. And so the German restaurant is going to be meeting is going to be much more about meeting the expectations of an audience that may or may not have an understanding of what German food is, rather than working and striving towards creating and presenting a radical portal into contemporary German foodways. That doesn't mean that they can't serve to educate. It doesn't mean that they can't provide an entry point into things more coterminous with how German food actually is in its originating context. But you imagine there's some kind of sort of translation, or at least some kind of fractional representation is happening there. Similarly, we can talk about region, and region really works for North American perspective because we're already talking about, because of its colonizing past, we're talking about regions, geographies that have sometimes inherited cuisines from their immigrant context, and that have been reimagined in coming in contact with locality, with landscape, with local produce, and with other populations. So, Southwestern cuisine is a good example of that, which also breaks into subregions. But the sort of idea of Tex-Mex, where you have Anglo and German, probably those are the two major European influences. Anglo and German and Hispanic influences, but the Hispanic one had been another century or two influenced by Mesoamerican indigenous cuisines and the local food expectations, and then differing contemporary context for when it is eaten. And you have this thing that is, it's difficult to point as a specific ethnicity as part of Tex-Mex cuisine, but you can see it as a confluence, and you can see it as a confluence that is dependent on an understanding of the history of its region. And then, of course, you can experience it elsewhere, because Tex-Mex becomes a place that you can also have restaurants in. You can have a Tex-Mex restaurant in Germany, and then you're experiencing not really American food in the same way that a German restaurant might present it in North America, but in some kind of I'm experiencing some other region. We'll sometimes talk about time. She spends a little bit of time talking about sort of like future foods, like freeze-dried ice cream and all the sort of space foods. Much more likely, we were talking about differences in terms of generations back. So, and again, when we talk about food and foodways, we're also talking about the manner in which food is prepared and served and eaten. So, in Cape Breton, one of the main attractions at the Fortress of Louisbourg, which is the historical site, the open-air living historical museum that reproduces the French fort in the 40s to 1760s, is the food that one can have there, and the way that the tables are communal, that the cutlery is limited. They still take debit and tap, but the way it is served is just as important as the food that is eaten there. And you get to experience what life was like 250 years ago. It's like, cool, they had bread. But we seek that out. What did these people eat like? And that is the otherness that we are interested in. So that's like the 18th century. But the 50s diner is a good example of that. There are entire restaurants at Walt Disney World that are predicated on step back in time and eat at this kind of place. So, and you might be thinking, well, Disney World doesn't count. It definitely does, because we are questioning this very issue of authenticity, but it is this presentation of experiencing of otherness, and the questions are chosen. We might go into it recognizing that this might not be an authentic representation, but nevertheless it is a representation, and we are seeking out that representation when we go there. There's ethos or religion as another realm. Um, so we have things like we might go kosher food, for example. We might be interested in vegan food. And even if we are not vegan ourselves, we might go to a vegan restaurant or try vegan food products. And say, oh, okay, so this is what it's like. And, it's a food system that is being presented, different from our belief system, as it were. Eating food that is halal. And again, sometimes being, breaking what might be our food systems, because it might be sort of a form of I'm wishing to have something else. So, when one steps outside, if one has a fairly restricted food system based on religious understanding, as a form of not apostasy, but a form of a little bit of rebellion. You might occasionally sort of step outside and have like this. So, and it is experiencing otherness in that kind of way. She wrote this socioeconomic class. She talks about things because her framework is primarily the Midwest. When she was writing this, it was for Midwest folklore, and she was based in Ohio. And so, they will have things like redneck restaurants or sort of white trash food or so on. On occasion. Certainly you might not necessarily have restaurants that reflect on that, but you will reflect on things like cookbooks that do the same, like roadkill cookbooks and so on, which do that kind of reflection. Similarly, we will sometimes think of like incredibly the food restaurants, dining establishments and foodways of the elites. And so things that are above the typical expectations of sort of like the thick North American middle class. So Russian tea rooms, high tea that are sometimes presented at fancy hotels or fancy restaurants and so on, where you are momentarily stepping. And again, often it's associated with time. These realms are not distinct from each other, but often you're sort of stepping back into some kind of fin de siècle elegance of having tea at the Savoy and that kind of thing. Not the Savoy Theatre in Glace Bay, but a different tea at the Savoy. So we engage in that. So that's 5. The 2 that she doesn't talk about are gender and age. And she's right, I think, in terms of, I can't think of gender-themed restaurants per se. Age, less so, but again, experiencing otherness. But as a way of foodways, I think we expressly do experience that, because there are foods that are marked as feminine, and there are foods that are marked as masculine. And every now and then, we sort of might venture across. If we want to think about food, it's like, I don't think that's necessarily the case. Firstly, we can point to things like meat as being specifically framed as more masculine, the sort of meat and salad dichotomy that, again, it's not true, but it is presented as a theme. So we need to at least heed the idea that the theme is present in contemporary culture before we dissect it and recognize that it is not an absolute, but a construct. But we can also think about drinks, and we can look at a drink menu, or go to the club and see the drinks that are being presented as more feminine or more masculine. And so we might think of things like the hyper masculinization of beer and scotch, and conversely, we sort of have, and there might be masculine cocktails like martinis and so on, James Bond associated cocktails. But then we have things like appletinis and cosmos and so on that are girl drinks, as it were. You think of the Kids in the Hall sketch, Girl Drink Drunk, and it's again, they are conceits, but they are also created specifically with that in mind. So we can occasionally, it's like, you know what, I'm going to have an appletini, and I'm going to demonstrate my masculinity by being able to engage in a feminine drink. Anyway, that's fine. And age, I think, is definitely there. She does mention it ever so briefly, but we can think about momentarily, even just experiencing what a little kid might be eating, and especially as a form of memory work, we might make ourselves or seek out food that is a memory of our past. Because of when McNuggets were introduced, I don't have childhood associations with McNuggets because I'm a very old man. But I imagine people who are maybe 5 or 10 years younger than I, when they have, sometimes they might have McNuggets as a form of comfort food because, oh, okay, because this is the food that they might have had when they were kids. And so it's like a bit of memory work in that way, but experiencing of otherness. I'm going to eat something from the child's menu. And certainly children are obsessed with adult food, generational food. Again, when you think about drinks, but I remember being fascinated. I'm sure because my father was an alcoholic, but I remember being fascinated by his rum and scotch and beer and so on, and coffee. And so you take coffee, and when you experiencing it, it's definitely an aged food. And my son is obsessed with my idea with the coffee I drink, and he will occasionally take sips of it, and he's like, okay, and I'll say, eventually you'll probably have this. So he's tentatively exploring the otherness of adult beverages, wholesome adult beverages, in anticipation of eventually having them. Because one of the things that happens, and I'm skipping out of order for chapter, is that this otherness is shifts. This otherness shifts on 2 different levels. The individual will shift in terms of what they have because they are transformative. Because you experience this otherness, and first you encounter it as a form of other and exotic and different and potentially, and there's always this kind of element of risk. If the risk is only dislike, where it isn't necessarily as intense as cannot stand, but just more like okay, this was not worth seeking out. So that can happen. But once you have had it, you have had it. You have transformed in some kind of way. It might not be the massive transformation of pilgrimage. It might not be the massive transformation of sort of the ecstatic rite of passage. But okay, you have gone from having eaten this food, of having never eaten this food, to having eaten this food. A couple of years ago, I was in Sweden, and I was by myself, and the first night of the night before a conference, and didn't know anyone in town. Went to the restaurant. It's like, what am I going to have? I'm going to have steak tartare, and I had steak tartare for the first time, and it was lovely. But I was like, oh, that's a thing. And what's more, it becomes a story. It becomes something that I can talk about later on, and like I am doing right now. I've gone from being a non-steak tartare person to a steak tartare person. Will I have it again? I don't know, but I have had it. I have transformed, and these realms change because 2 things. First, we change, and our baseline is constantly adapting over time because we shift through generations, because we move, because having experienced otherness, we then incorporate it into our daily lives, and that becomes our ordinary everyday food, and almost to the point of we don't consider it as other anymore. It is ours. And even if it's food that we never had as a child, we don't, and we might have narratives associated with our early encounters with it on the practical level. And it's just what we do. I mean, it's almost non-reflective in that this is the food that we eat. And that I can be talking about it on the individual level, but we can also be talking about it on the collective level, where food that was at one time considered highly exotic is now so normalized we barely think of it. In fact, it's really only different because we continue to name it as different, but it is so very regular. And you want to think about sort of Canadian Chinese food or Chinese Canadian food, and that is being part of the Canadian food landscape for 150 years. And even the smallest towns often will have a Chinese restaurant, and yes, they still yes, it's still food that isn't prepared at home, so it's still a restaurant experience. And yes, it is food that is in a building that is often decorated with Chinese symbols and like the waving cats, and they use script, Chinese fonts on their menus, and is decorated as such. But it isn't. It doesn't seem other. It doesn't seem foreign. It doesn't seem exotic necessarily, because it's food that has been part of your regular celebration. I guess it was Christmas Eve, and I was walking past one of the restaurants in downtown Sydney, and a huge line out the door. It's like, do people eat Chinese food on Christmas Eve? It's like, yeah, people eat Chinese food on Christmas Eve. Like, I didn't know. So it's just part, without even thinking. And again, like, pizza was an exotic food at one point. Now it is not. And so our shifts change. You want to talk to an older generation about the produce section at a grocery store and the things that you will walk by on a regular basis. Things like the zucchini bin, and say, hey, grandma, when did you first encounter zucchini? And they'll probably have a story. And zucchini is something that you have probably never even realized was exotic, because it's just always been there. Doesn't mean that you don't like it, or that you do like it, but it doesn't necessarily strike you as different. So these realms shift, and these realms shift and accommodate, and the world changes. People are also, as they are interested in their exotic food, as they're interested in their other food, they might also be much more concerned about the ethics of their foodways than they were before. So they might be, I want to try something different, but I am still sort of committed to ethical food practices. I'm committed to veganism or vegetarianism or plant-based diets, to locavores, to is this ethically sourced in terms of import and so on. So those considerations that we might not have had 20 or 30 years ago are now very active, and food tourism operators will often, sometimes retroactively, sometimes lagging behind, but they will seek to accommodate that because they are trying to meet the expectations of their audiences. So this conversation that happens, this I wish to seek out otherness, let me present you with the other, but let me present you with the other in a way that you are able to understand it. She also talks about, I just want to go back out of her order, and I want to talk about what she talks the sort of these realms of culinary experience, where she creates these three axes, and they're very important to consider, because she talks about this sort of difference that we have between the familiar and the exotic, where the familiar and the exotic is this sort of, in a way, that is the initial frame of otherness, like the naming of things. What do I normally eat, and what is being presented to me? And it's kind of a continuum, because the exotic sort of starts to be almost to the point of, I don't even understand this as food, or understand how it is eaten, and then whatever. So I don't necessarily need to explain what familiar means, but it's good to sort of consider that there are forms of gradation, and it's good to consider their forms of gradation, because we want to talk in a minute or two, we want to talk about the various strategies that food providers, that tourism operators or culinary tourism food operators provide in order to ease the audience into the exotic. It's like, so one of the things that they do is, while emphasizing that this is different from the everyday, they will nevertheless put it in terms that you can recognize and understand. So it's like, oh, okay, this is our version of this thing. Oh, okay, you'll do that. I'm going to talk about that in a second, because I want to go back and talk about those three realms. So there's familiar and the exotic. And then there is the inedible and the edible. And the inedible and the edible, I want to stress, because every time I talk about the inedible and the edible, and people ask what is the inedible, I ask for an example of the inedible, they think of, students will often think of things like rocks or, metal or calculators or something. It's like, no. When we're talking about inedible foods and edible foods, we are talking about the systems that are in place around them, what we consider food, what we do not consider food. And so we can recognize that it is something that the human body can process, that it might be something that someone else finds edible, but I do not. And a good example of that is again, going back to the ethos question, laws of kashrut, laws of halal, where there are certain things that are prohibited, proscribed. You cannot eat of these things. They do not comprise food because they will make the body, they're ritually unclean, and they will make the body ritually unclean. So, pork products, the mixing of milk and meat, and yeah, I mean, in kashrut, the mixing of milk and meat. An animal that hasn't been slaughtered in a way that brings dignity to the animal. So like halal and kosher butchers are special kinds of butchers who not only will only butcher certain animals because other animals are not edible, but they will do so in a way that respects the body. And so, that's what one seeks out. And so a food that I cannot eat because of my idea of what comprises food is, you can frame as an inedible food. I understand that a human body can consume that, but I cannot. It is inedible to me. So in addition to systems like kashrut and halal and veganism, we also have systems that aren't necessarily as well articulated. We have, but I'm just as an example, the fact that for the most part in North America, we don't eat horse, we don't eat dog, we don't eat cat. And the question is why? I'm not going to ask a devil's advocate question. I'm not going to like, oh, you should. But I mean, we don't eat them because, and of course, because is one of, because without follow-up is one of the hallmarks of folklore and the idea of tradition. This is what we do because this is what we do. But we will frame these foods, these animals, as inedible. We can't eat these. And we can recognize, again, with that pushing towards but not trying to venture into devil's advocacy, we can recognize that these are foods that are potentially edible, or animals that are potentially edible, but we will not eat them. Why? Because we will not eat them. End of sentence. So, another thing to think about is how inedible and unpalatable connect with each other, or that third realm, the palatable, unpalatable, because inedible and inedible has to do with how we recognize something as food or not. It doesn't fit into this category. Palatable is about taste. It is about the sensory experience of food. It is about grasping food as potentially satisfying, pleasant, or unpleasant, and often these things overlap, and that and certainly they will overlap because our conscious understanding of something as inedible might introduce such levels of disgust that we're almost not taking our sensory experiences into account. So, but a good example is, can you think of something that is both inedible? It is not. I do not recognize it as food. At least I do not recognize it as food, but palatable. I recognize it as delicious. And a good example of that is the Oreo. The Oreo has been, it was only in the 1990s when it was certified as kosher. So prior to that, it was not recognized as food, as suitable food for someone who is maintaining the laws of kashrut, because they had not gone through the certification process to assure that it was purely plant-based and it was made in a clean, kosher facility. So because they could not assure that, it couldn't be consumed because you didn't know what animal product was in it. You couldn't be eaten with milk because even if it was a clean animal, if it was meat-based, it couldn't be consumed. But clearly it's delicious because it's an Oreo. Who doesn't like an Oreo? I was going to show you an Oreo. Look at this. Isn't it gorgeous? Isn't it tasty? We all know an Oreo is beautiful. And so, but they didn't. They hadn't certified it until the 1990s. All of a sudden they could, and they did, and they were delicious, and it was wonderful. And the same thing had happened earlier in the century when Crisco invented shortening, and all of a sudden you had food that was, not all of a sudden, why do I use the word all of a sudden so often? And North American food preparation techniques that were already prevalent and part of sort of like the mainstream hegemonic culture were now open to Jews, and they could make pastries and they could make pies because they were no longer restricted to, oh, I can't make this because it has lard, and lard is just a whipped pig fat. But now I have a plant-based food, a plant-based ingredient, and now I can participate in this while maintaining the laws of sanctity that my culture requires of me. Now I'm going to eat this Oreo. Mmm. Mmm. And once more. Mmm. So finally, she talks about these strategies about how the food provider meets the expectations of otherness without breaking the expectations of otherness. How do they frame this as something that the tourist should cast their tourist gaze upon? Something that you experience this and you will experience something that is different from your everyday. Seek it out, enjoy it, but it will not sort of shatter that level of being too exotic. And it might test your expectations of what is considered palatable and impalatable, but it will not break them. Trust me, it is delicious. And it might test your apprehensions of what can and can't be eaten. It's like, but trust me, don't worry, it's fine. It's food. It's still food. Don't worry, it's still food. Might not be the food you're used to, but still food. So trust me, it is actually edible. So she comes up with a number of examples. And I'm going to be switching between using the example of a restaurant, using the example of a cookbook or a blog, because these are sort of, they might all be present in all forms, but some might be better explained by using just one. So one of them is framing. So the literal stage, the literal space in which this discussion and often this meal takes place. Walk into a restaurant. It has a name. The name is suggestive of something. It has a decor. It has a font choice. It has a wait staff that are wearing particular chosen outfits, and the experience is going to be put on some kind of stage that you walk into. It's like, this is something that is different. A cookbook might have an exotic cover and a name, but anyway, you're being told that this is a circumscribed set of difference. Still manageable difference, it's still articulatable difference, but it is difference nonetheless. Then the naming. The naming or the translation. So a food will be not simply literally translated in terms of from its originating cuisine name to a North American or English language name, but also sometimes a metaphorical translation. So she uses the example of bulgogi in Korea, which means fire meat, which sounds doesn't provide enough texture. It doesn't provide enough meaning. So it's like, oh, well, this is just braised beef strips. And I'm like, okay, I can handle that. And so, carry on. And so it just provides that additional bit of, removes just that little bit of ambiguity where it's still there. This is something that it's going to be fun. It's going to be weird. It's going to be exotic. You're going to enjoy this. It's going to be other, but it's not like a, huh? Then you have explication, where you have, it is, as the word suggests, it is literally explained. You ever been to a restaurant and there's a little paragraph under each dish? And sometimes it's just straightforward. Here's what it is. And sometimes it's narrativized. And there's just that little bit of additional information. If you go into a cookbook and you might have a whole half page about the food, about its history, about the chef's history with it, about the chef's family history with it, a little bit of pat regional history that's associated with it. Cool. You ever go to a blog and it's like that contemporary joke about scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling until you actually get to how the thing is made? A lot of that is about explication. It's about contextualizing through narrative, not through name, what the food is and what the experience is going to be. There's also selection, because not everything that is potentially representable from an other cuisine, and we're always thinking in terms of this otherness, is going to be made available, because it's about meeting the expectations. And so it's like, if I know that the majority of people who are going to walk into my restaurant, or the majority of people who are going to read my blog, are not going to be interested in this, either because it is too exotic, because it's like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I can't handle that, or, you know, for whatever reason, or because it's not exotic enough, because it's like, this is not it. So I have a friend in Norway who studies the doner as a national food, an important national food in Norway. And the doner is, the doner kebab is not something that people would necessarily go to Norway for. So if there's such a thing as a Norwegian restaurant, it doesn't have doner at it, because it's like, this isn't what I think of when I think about Norway. So it's representative. So the menu selection process is representative on both ends. So this is it would take me too long to convince you why you should have doner. So I'm just not even going to bother it, and I'm going to instead have all the stuff that you anticipate as being Norwegian, while also staying away from the stuff that is far too Norwegian for you to understand. But again, in performance, we have a potential repertoire, and then we have honed it to meet the expectations of the audience. And it doesn't mean that it's not impossible. I mean, if ingredients are available, if you could probably go into the restaurant, and if you're familiar with the cuisine, say, could you do it this way? It's like, okay, yeah, sure. But that's sort of a special request. So it's not an impossibility. For the most part, it is about meeting the exoteric assumptions of its crowd by basing it on the reflective esoteric assumptions of the restaurateurs themselves, or the bloggers themselves. And finally, you have adaptation. You have adaptation for a number of reasons. You have it for the simple economic expedience. I cannot get this thing around here, or it's economically impractical to import this thing, so I'm just going to use something else. Local mushrooms as opposed to regional mushrooms. Local fish, local whatever, instead of. This is a fair substitution. Sometimes it might be a matter of it might require, not simply vegetable ingredients, but livestock ingredients that aren't available. You might switch it that way. You might adapt in terms of the level of intensity of the spices, or level of intensity of some of the seasonings. It's like, well, we really like it salty, but even North Americans who love salt find this dish too salty, so we reduce the salt a little bit. We might be switching it in terms of portion, in that it's actually made very similarly to how it would be made back in the originating community. However, we're providing a North American sized portion, which is something that we do, because North Americans, in order to understand what a meal is, it might be a hefty amount of food on a plate. Like a plate has to be this big and has to be filled with food, and that's what food is. That's what a meal is, and anything else is just like a side. It's like, oh, okay, and then I guess we have to make this much. So we're adapting to meet the expectations of a meal in and of itself. The adaptation might take place in terms of how it is served, and that North Americans like everything on the one plate, as opposed to necessarily sort of set out and people are sharing off of a common platter. We don't common platter except on very special occasions. We don't typically common platter in restaurants. Anyway, I'm starting to digress. So what I like about this reading, and I've been teaching it for years, and yet I'm literally only now, as I am recording this, I am only now realizing how influential it has been on the way that I think about folklore in general, because it is about this understanding of expectations of one's audience. The potential audience knows certain has expectations coming into a thing, and the good performer is there to meet those expectations, to try and meet and exceed those expectations. And so good performers are what makes them a good performer is the understanding of their audience. And as I said, I've been teaching this article for the better part of 15 years. I've been teaching about audiences similarly and working in my own world, and I had never quite married these two. And so, just thinking out loud today, it's helped me, which is kind of why I do this. Anyway, my friends, I'm going to stop there. We have been talking about Lucy Long's Culinary Tourism, a folkloristic perspective on eating and otherness. I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.